I know there's been a few measurements taken under Salvinia mat and getting readings like 0.2 oxygen or 0 oxygen. And if you have something like bass, then they're not going to be able to live in those kind of conditions. Maybe carp, something like that, something that you really wouldn't want to catch. It also restricts the sunlight for aquatic plants and from the microscopic algae that make up a big part of the base of the food chain. It's like the little things are there, and then the slightly bigger ones eat them, and the slightly bigger ones, and then all the way to the top predators, the bass and so forth. Well, if you yank one of those rungs out of the food, links out of the food chain, you really don't have much of a food chain. And it also results in increased sedimentation. The plant puts off tons and tons and tons of dead material and increased evaporation. You might not think so, but the plant's equivalent of sweating, which is called transpiration, evapotranspiration, actually puts out more water if the surface is covered with Salvinia than it would otherwise. So you're losing water, a most precious commodity. Next slide. Okay, so how do we control this? What can we do? Well, these are the methods, and I'm not going to go through all that. You can read just as well as I can, I'm sure, but chemical, mechanical drawdowns, or water level manipulation, you might call it, and biological. The chemicals have been used for a long time, and they are fast and effective in open water. They're also expensive, but it doesn't last. And part of it is because when you have a lake like Caddo or like Bistineau, you can't get at it all in the first place. You have those cypress breaks. I'm much more familiar with Caddo, but there's lots of areas you can't get into with any kind of boat. And also, like I say, miss a ramming. That one ramming, you might have 40 square miles in 3 months. And all these lakes are eutrophic, and there's also some input from nitrogen, farmland, lawns, various other things like that. Mechanical, I'm afraid it just isn't, it doesn't work. It's not effective enough. It's just not fast enough. The best ones get maybe 10, 12 acres a day. And you have, again, you have all these cypress breaks they can't get into. Drawdowns, I know drawdowns have been very popular here, and in the short term, they can be very effective. They kill a lot of plants when you're trying to strand them on the dry ground, but there always seem to be some that survive, and a lot of it also just flows out through the floodgate. And so the people downstream don't appreciate that very much. So that leaves you with biological. And this is what, and it has its own problems. There's nothing that's perfect, but under warm conditions, it's been very effective. In southern Louisiana, it's been very effective. And there are some issues with using it at this latitude, but I'm going to talk about some of those in a little bit. It really came about because of what the work the Australians done. The Australians realized they had a big problem with this stuff in 1954. They pulled out all the stops. They were spraying out of hovercraft and things that you couldn't begin to spray now. They're so toxic. 24 years it is, and the problem was worse than when they started. So, and then they had been realizing that in about 75, 76, they made a concerted effort to look for biological control agents. Because and that's typically how it happens. If what you're doing doesn't work, well, maybe you'll try biological control. So they went to the native range of Salvinia, which is Brazil, southern Brazil, and looked to see what kept it under control there. And that's kind of the key, that things are not normally invasive, they're not a big pest, where they evolve, because other things evolve with them and keep each other in check. So, let's see, what did I get there? Okay. 78 vast areas. That was their quote. Was covered with Salvinia. Their scientists introduced the weevils after having gone through testing to see they were specific and all that. That's some big step you have to take. And cleared about 1,000-acre infestation in 11 months. This is in the southern part of Australia, and they also did, eventually establish that it didn't work as well in the extreme north and the extreme south. In Australia, the south would be pulled apart, and that you needed a combined effort. Next slide, please. And these are those lakes. One on the left, before biological control, one on the right, after biological control. They only released about 5,500 weevils, which is not much. No one's ever actually done that well since. It works very, very, very well. And you can't really see it on this scale, but there is some Salvinia floating around, some little bits floating around the edges, and that has weevils in it. So it can't become invasive when the insect, the herbivore, is feeding on it like that. They've gone into that equilibrium that existed in the native range. Next slide, please. Well, it got to the U.S. in 1998. Prior to that, I should mention, it was found all around the world, all around the equator, where it had been spread by people through the aquarium trade, so on and so forth. When it got here, basically it was a big shock, and they tried the same approach, really, chemicals. And still, chemicals are the prime means of trying to control it. Next slide, please. But there's been an increasing interest in weevils. And this is the greenhouse that I was managing at LSU. I did this for about 5.5 years as a research associate, which is to say a full-time job. So I lived, ate, slept, dreamed weevils, and which would explain the switch. But it was really a colony, and I had 43 of these cattle troughs is what I had. And I grew a colony in there that I did my thesis on. I dissected a whole lot of these things. Looked at the reproductive systems and tried to find a way to, and did find a way to stage their development so you could kind of look at a population and tell a lot more about what was going on with it. Next slide, please. So, I don't have a pointer, but there's a couple of eggs in the first slide on the left. And the one on the top right is a larvae in an egg. These are taken under a microscope. And then the one at the bottom of that is a larvae that is preparing to pupate. And he is the adult. Next slide. Okay. At the same time, while I was doing that, I was monitoring one of Wildlife and Fisheries' first ponds where they were raising them in southern Louisiana. This is a 6-acre pond in Gaines, Louisiana. And on the right, you can see it's green, but it's starting to show signs of stress. There's some little holes opening up in it. And this was like in June. And the population had really begun to come up. But it still looked pretty healthy, really, overall. Okay, the second slide on the right is about mid-August, when a whole bunch of this stuff had become so damaged that it sank. It was a very, very short period of time to do that. I might add that Wildlife and Fisheries came in and grabbed, I think they said 25 tons or something like that, which was maybe about 1/5 of it, or something like that, and brought it to Bistineau. And of course, you had the worst winter anybody ever had here, and it destroyed most of them. Killed a lot of the Salvinia, but as you see, it's back. Next slide. Okay, and this is what I monitored the population growth. I go down there and sampling, getting the weevils out of the samples and counting them under the microscope. So, and this is kind of typical of what happens. See, in the winter months, the cold months, there's not much population growth. Of course, there's not much Salvinia growth either. It takes to the life cycle of the Salvinia. And then, once the water gets warm enough, the population basically soars. Whenever you see that almost straight line, that's exponential growth. The plant is capable of exponential growth, and so is the insect. And when it hit that top, it hit 40, then it went into what's called an extinction curve, where the plant's growing, and the weevil is growing, and one's getting the better of the other, and then it shot up to 63, and after that, it went to 0. There was not enough even left to sample. This is only a 6-acre pond, right? But it did happen very, very quickly. And it can when it happens. Next slide, please. Okay, so I went to work at Caddo Lake, and this was one of our sites in Caddo, and this is what's called bird's roost. And we had released weevils in May and July, and came back in September, and you can see this stuff's not green. There's a lot of green stuff growing on it, and you can see it. Sometimes it looks like a hayfield. Stuff gets rooted in it. But the plant itself is very stressed. And the numbers have gone from, say, 4 a kilo, which is how I measure it by weight, to 23 a kilo, and then shortly thereafter to 27. So these plants were really getting beaten up. And where the mat was like 6 to 8 inches thick, here it was about 3. So the tremendous damage to the plant. Next slide, please. So the following spring, you can see there was a big difference in how that area looked. One on the right is the area that I was just showing you, and the one on the left is right nearby. And that's burgers, and that's what all of that looked like. So we did have a very healthy population of weevils. It was a mild winter, and they overwintered well. Next slide, please. And this is the following October, something like a year later, a little over a year later. And this is a kind of a really strange sight there, but all of these plants get started, flowers, all kinds of things, on top of the mat, and then the mat was so destroyed by the weevils that it was sinking. The plants were sinking with it. And unfortunately, the next time I went out, the batteries in my camera died, but there were 35 acres that were about 98% cleared. Okay, and it's, you know, that's not much when you're talking about 6,000 or 7,000 acres, but it's a beginning. And it shows what they can do. Essentially, from the initial release site was about 3.5 acres. They had cleaned out 35, 10 times. I was hoping they'd overwinter if we could do that again. You know, I would be talking about 350 acres. Unfortunately, the weather didn't cooperate, which it usually doesn't. Right? Next slide, please. And this is a little map. You can see that was the area that was kind of cleaned out. And there were, you know, there was some Salvinia left, but it mostly, you got it, which wasn't easy to find, really. It had weevils on it. It also kind of demonstrates how difficult it is to work with Caddo because you can hardly see the water from the trees. It's one of the biggest cypress forests in the world. So I just wanted to point out some other success stories because it just seems to be progressing over time. At Lake Steinhagen, which is a little bit south of Sam Rayburn, Corps of Engineers have been working on that and so forth. And so they had about 300 acres that dropped out in a period of about a few months, 2 weeks rather. And they continue to add weevils and they continue to expand. They're overwintering well there. It's not too far south of here, but you're going to drive it in about an hour and a half to 2 hours if you're going straight south from Caddo. But they've done very, very well, and they are now using about 1/3 of the herbicides that we're using to control the Salvinia on the lake, getting better control. This is Delta Farms, Southern Louisiana. LSU was really ahead of everybody on this. This was one of their sites, and this Delta Farms, I believe they had 5,000 or 6,000 acres that year, and it has done much the same thing, which has reduced it to like 2 or 3% of what it was. So, with all that in mind, as the A&M project came to an end, I helped the local group build what basically my dream way to produce them. And, you know, we went ahead with my way of dealing with the whole thing, which you see this greenhouse, first of all, has heat, so we can bring up the heat, and we'll be doing that soon. Late in the winter, we get a mature population to turn out in the Salvinia just as it starts to green up, which that normally doesn't happen. Normally, the weevils will lag behind the Salvinia. So I think that will be very effective. We can also extend the growing season into the fall and cool it during the middle of the summer to keep production up. Normally, at this latitude, you get 2 or 3 generations a year, and that's about it. And I'm thinking we can get 5, maybe 6. Also, the work involved, it's all physical, it's very physical. So it has rows of tanks that can be accessed from the outside and a drive-through. And I have, I don't think you can see, we have these totes. The tote that is there fits into these little garden carts. And we have Duraforks, so you can actually load the totes, wheel them down to the drive-through without ever having lifted it, load it on the truck, and then take it to the dock or take it to, somewhere for land breeders, which we got this thing built like in July. Actually, there's still some tweaking that needs to be done, but enough to fill the tanks, put Salvinia in and start raising weevils. So we did do a release from land with a whole bunch of volunteers and put out about 35,000 weevils. So it actually performed just like it was supposed to. You know, now there's still further refinements to be made, and they haven't gotten to the full growing season yet. So, but the idea is to show what we can do with a facility like this, where you know high production levels compared to typically what has been done, and release them into an area that is enclosed, there's no drift, there's no current, and it's sheltered, and in fact, Salvinia always seems to survive there. So it's a good place to serve as a nursery. You get them started in there, and transport them somewhere else. And it's going to be just an iffy thing with the weather. If we have some good weather, we'll get a lot of weevil production. You know, if the winter kills what we have on the lake, and it's possible, if it kills 98% of the Salvinia, your weevils are going to die too, right? But we will still have some in the greenhouse ready to go on a much smaller Salvinia population. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll take some questions. This is a little demo shot of Caddo. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
I've written several emails to the fine folks in Baton Rouge about the weevils,
Yeah.
and they're not buying it up here. They said the cold tolerant weevils. So my suggestion, what you just said, when it's cold, they both die off. So restock it when it gets warm. It's like farming. Okay? You don't plant your crop in December. You do it in March. Is there any? Can you get them to go in that direction?
Well, that's actually, well, I don't know that I can really influence them. You know, there's.
You don't plant 365 is what I'm trying to say.
Pardon?
You don't release 365. You just do it when it's
No, I don't have any interest in releasing that way or being able to justify the expense of doing
like
so.
spraying right now. But go ahead.
Yeah. What you're saying is very true. And that's really kind of why we approached it in this way. That, you know, in the winter, the Salvinia is dormant, it's not growing, you know, you kind of hunker down rather than use the heat, you know, to produce weevils and put them out in, you know, substandard stuff that can't really probably, not nutritious.
Right.
You know, it's dyed back, and it may freeze, it may get washed out, so your odds are not good, you know. But I think when the season begins to get good for what we're doing,
Exactly.
when we come out, you know, in a big way, put it that way. Yes, ma'am.
I have three questions. How far can weevils be transported and survive? How important is native water? And when all this plant matter drops out, what effect does that have on habitat and wildlife? Does the lake bottom need to be rehabbed over time?
So give me the first one again.
How hard can weevils be transported and survive?
Well, Wildlife Fisheries transported them from beans up to Bistineau, and they said they had very good survival. And I was doing a lot of the sampling, and I was getting adults, and I was getting some larvae. I have to say, though, as hot as it was, because I remember that, I had pictures of myself when they were getting it, you probably had some mortality in the larvae and maybe the eggs. But no one actually looked at that. Now, one of the things that I, with my setup, is that I, you know, pushed for having something. It takes us, like 2 minutes to the actual lake. We're just right across the street from the lake. So even if you had 90% survival, we'd have 100.
Yeah.
You know, that's always better, right? Your second question, please.
How important is native water? Like they're raising one water, you take them to another water?
That actually is very important, and that was one of the problems at Caddo with the A&M setup. There were some other problems with where it was and all this. But there's inevitably going to be shock. And if you're raising them in water that is, for instance, over-enriched, nitrogen is the thing that drives growth of almost everything, actually, but including weevils. And you put them into water that is low in nitrogen, they may not be able to adapt. There's probably going to be high mortality. You know, so it's good to, right now we're pumping water from the lake into our tanks. You know, we grow the Salvinia in there, and we do enrich it a little bit, you know, but not out of the range, because actually it's like many, many things. You raise them on, you know, you raise purebred heifer on, you know, really super great diet and all, you put them out in the dry cow pasture. They don't do well. You know, it's very hard to make those adjustments. Third question?
And when all the plant matter drops out, what effect does that have over time? I mean, year after year, this stuff is dying, and, well, maybe after it gets controlled, it doesn't die out as much, or contribute as much?
It doesn't contribute as much, you're right, but it is a concern, and like everyone, you know, is concerned that the stuff will rot the water, and it'll take the oxygen out of the water. It decomposes slowly, but it is contributing to, like what I say, sedimentation, where it just keeps adding and adding and adding. I can tell you, I walked around out there in Caddo, and waders, and you got muck on the bottom and a mat on the top, and in between is all kinds of dead plant material. It is definitely stealing the oxygen out of the water. However, nothing's quite as bad as having the Salvinia air.
To illustrate that, Caddo Lake does not have drawdown structure on it, and the bottom sediment of Caddo versus the bottom sediment of Bistineau. Caddo is highly organic, black, tarry, when you get a motor up there, it just boils organic sediments for a long time, and years and years of accumulation of any vegetation merged underwater, the decomposition rates are primarily going to have to be anaerobic, with no oxygen, much slower. And it is certainly, Salvinia is what we have kind of referred to as a two-headed monster. There is a monster on top that you're looking at that is, killing the top of it, and then there is what is falling to the bottom that is hurting, killing your lake from the bottom of it. So that is also another benefit of the program that we've been on with drawdowns, although it is not the answer, but it helps combat that negative buildup and degradation of the bottom habitat.
One problem that exacerbates it at Caddo is that they diverted a lot of the water that was the actual source from the west for reservoirs. So they're probably getting 60% of the flow down Big Cypress Body Wash. That's Big Cypress Body, the picture I had up there. So there's a lot less flow, so that doesn't help. And the Texas side is the swampy side, it's shallow backwaters. It's really a beautiful side, if you ask me. But that kind of thing eventually leads to, it keeps filling in and new plants grow and all that, and so eventually it would lead to it being a plain or, eventually forest, growing up. And this is greatly accelerating the rate at which that would take place.
Is there a place for volunteers in a weevil facility?
Well, actually, the way it's been set up in Texas is that a lot of the work is done by volunteers. I'm actually the only paid person. I'm a contractor for this group. So it was really my idea, my plan, and blueprint, for doing the thing in my system and for raising them. They did a lot of the fundraising and so forth. I did write a couple of grants, and but there's not a lot of money around now. So if you're just going now, they're going through the typical channels. Well, no one wants to give up what money they had or they were getting, So it's what we have been cobbled together. We got a little bit of money from the county, from the town of Uncertain. That's where it's located, Uncertain, Texas. And lots of individuals have donated money or materials or labor and so forth to get the things built. The greenhouse itself was built in place, and there's a lot of, I can't go into it all, but there's a lot of things that make that much more efficient than I think anything else that's out there. Sir?
Okay, sweet. What's the optimal temperature for weevil production?
When the water gets to be 68, the population will start to move. When it gets to be, when the temperature, or I guess you'd say the water temperature, when that gets to be like 96, then you're probably worrying about the immatures in particular, the larvae and the eggs. And somewhere in between, and you would say, well, it's, it gets really hot. Well, if they come from a tropical environment and in the water, hanging at the roots or, inside the plant, it's a little cooler. They have ways of adapting. Yes, ma'am.
Have you any research results of what would happen with the combination of the weevils and spraying?
Well, there's been some work on that, and I think most people do, in fact, feel that is what's going to happen, some combination of things. There was a little bit of an experiment done when I was with A&M, and they said put some Salvinia in pools and sprayed it and put the weevils in the middle, and really that doesn't simulate. They did have survival related to the egg, but that doesn't really simulate what's going on if they're there and you spray them. If you put them in some good Salvinia, there's no reason they can't swim underneath on the edge. There was a band of good stuff around the edge. There are people who are very interested in that and working on that. Our Corps of Engineers is. I'm not sure what Father Bishop is doing there, but there is a lot of interest in this kind of thing. One of the problems is, if you have weevils in the Salvinia and you spray it, are you killing them? Are you killing insurers? Are you perhaps doing something that might have to do with reproduction? Because we're relying on their reproduction, relying on their numbers to keep on building. Because it's not until you get to that, if you're talking exponential growth, that third or fourth generation is when the numbers are just going to skyrocket. And if you don't get that, then you're not going to see those kind of effects. Now, hopefully there'll be winters where it will be warm enough and you have a surviving population, you can keep adding to them. But one thing about the cold weather, and we have had cold weather, we have seen the weevils and the Salvinia knocked back, is that we do have some survival still, and I'm going to be doing some more sampling here. And so this could very easily be the nucleus of a more cold tolerant generation. Or yes, sir.
When you place the weevils in the lake, how do you do one or two locations, or do you go all around the lake? What's the displacement of it?
Well, there's no one opinion on this, but my approach is to, the first release that we did is in an area called Williston Woodyard. We released 35,000 in just sort of a line parallel with the shore on the western side. About 20 feet, we were dumping about 400 or 500 these 18-gallon totes is what we had. Dumping one of those about every 10, 15 feet, put it that way. So the idea is to basically cause a lot of damage, because I think one of the things that drives weevil production and control of Salvinia is when the plants that die give up their nitrogen and kind of fuel the next round of population growth of the weevils. It decomposes slowly. It gives up phosphorus much more quickly, but nitrogen is the thing that basically all living things need to survive, and it's the limiting thing, put it that way. It's the limiting thing in any situation.